The candles burn low, and the air feels older somehow, as if time itself has slowed to listen. In Tudor England, love was not wild or free. It was measured, observed, and weighed against health, morality, and divine order. Desire was something to manage, not chase. Pleasure was medicine. Excess, a sin. Tonight we step quietly into that world, a world of humours and holiness, where even the heart obeyed reason. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's set the scene. The world of the Tudors moved to a quieter rhythm than ours, slower, steadier, more deliberate. Beneath the heavy beams of timbered ceilings and the long echo of church bells, life was ruled by invisible forces, not only by kings and decrees, but by the mysterious fluids that physicians called the humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. These were thought to be the hidden architects of health, emotion, and even morality. To the Tudor mind, every appetite, every sigh, every moment of joy or exhaustion came from the careful balance of these four essential elements. In that balance, sex had a place, not as an act of wild impulse, but as a gentle recalibration of the body's inner weather. To live well, one must eat modestly, sleep regularly, pray sincerely, and when the body required it, release its natural heat through the union of man and wife. It was neither scandalous nor indulgent, but part of a quiet medical order that tied flesh to philosophy. What we might call desire, they regarded as a humoral necessity. In the England of Henry VII and Henry VIII, physicians and preachers alike warned of the dangers of imbalance. Too much abstinence could lead to melancholy, a cold dampness of the soul that clouded thought and weighed down the spirit. But too much indulgence brought its own perils: weakness of the limbs, fevers, trembling, and the wasting away of manly strength. The proper course was moderation, a calm, regular intimacy that kept the blood warm but not overheated, that allowed the body to purge what it must without falling into sin or sickness. To a Tudor physician, good sex was not about pleasure alone. It was a matter of temperature and timing. The body, they believed, was like a small furnace: too much heat, and it burned itself out; too little, and it grew sluggish, heavy, and damp. A healthy man was said to be sanguine, filled with the right proportion of heat and moisture. A healthy woman was temperate, modest, and warm enough to nurture life. When these qualities met in harmony, the act of sex was seen as the meeting of two natural elements, like sunlight and earth joining to produce fruit. It is strange, perhaps, to imagine such thoughts guiding the intimate lives of people long dead: the nobleman in his candlelit chamber, the farmer's wife in her thatched cottage, both considering not the fire of passion but the state of their humours. Yet this was how the Tudors saw their own bodies, as instruments of divine order. The cosmos itself, they believed, was made of humours too, the elements of fire, air, water, and earth mirrored inside the human form. A disordered appetite was therefore not merely unhealthy, it was an act against the very harmony of creation. So when a Tudor man considered the question of how often to seek his wife's company, he did not look to romance or desire for the answer. He looked to reason, to scripture, and to the writings of ancient doctors. Galen, Hippocrates, and Avicenna still ruled English medicine, their words translated and recopied, their ideas taught in the universities of Oxford and Cambridge. They had written that sexual release, done in moderation, cleared the mind and refreshed the body, but that excess drained the vital spirits, making a man old before his time. These texts lingered like quiet authorities in the chambers of both physicians and confessors. Women too were thought to be shaped by the same rules of balance. Their bodies were believed to contain a softer heat, which required care and control. A woman too cold could not conceive, too hot, and she might fall into unruly humours, moods, longings, or sicknesses that unsettled her. Thus, a husband's duty was not simply affection or loyalty, but the maintenance of his wife's internal harmony. In the Tudor mind, the marriage bed was almost a medical space, an extension of the physician's art. From birth to death, this sense of balance guided every act of daily life. Physicians prescribed when to bathe, what to eat, when to sleep, and even when to touch one's spouse. A meal too rich or a night too restless could disturb the body's equilibrium, leading to illness or sin. The good life was not about abstaining from pleasure, it was about shaping it, taming it, and folding it into a divine rhythm. The Tudors were deeply aware that the body and soul could not be separated. A moral failing could make one sick, a sickness could tempt one to sin. To keep both in order required attention, a slow and deliberate care of oneself. This was not prudishness, but rather the natural extension of their worldview, that every human being was a small reflection of the divine cosmos, and that balance within meant harmony with God's greater plan. At night, perhaps, when the fire burned low and the house fell silent, these thoughts would hover like invisible prayers. The married couple, bound by faith and duty, approached intimacy not as indulgence but as a quiet ritual of health. Even pleasure, in its softest forms, was folded into the structure of obedience and care. There was no contradiction between desire and holiness, only degrees of temperature, measures of moderation, and the quiet awareness that even the warmest act must return to stillness. To live well, to love well, and to stay well, all three were one and the same. And in that delicate balance lay the Tudor vision of a good life, one where every act, even the most private, was a reflection of divine order. And so the idea of good sex was, for them, not a mystery or a secret art, but a daily part of human maintenance, as ordinary as prayer, as necessary as sleep. In this gentle harmony of humours, of heat and restraint, they found the rhythm of health itself. The understanding of that rhythm, however, would soon take on another shade, one drawn not only from morality, but from medicine itself, where the body's secret workings were believed to echo the will of the Creator. The body's secret workings were believed to echo the will of the Creator, and in that echo, physicians of the Tudor age claimed to hear the pulse of health itself. Sex, they wrote, was not merely a temptation to be resisted, but a quiet mechanism designed by nature, a release that renewed the spirit and clarified the blood. The learned men who filled the apothecaries' shelves with powders and tonics, who copied the writings of Galen and Avicenna by candlelight, saw in the act a sort of cleansing, a small and private therapy that returned the body to balance. In their view, the human frame was a vessel of heat and moisture. When that inner warmth grew excessive, it clouded judgment, reddened the eyes, and quickened the heartbeat. When it cooled too far, it dulled the senses and made the limbs heavy with phlegm. A moderate act of love was the natural correction, releasing the surplus of vital seed that, if retained too long, would ferment and fester. To withhold it, they warned, was to invite illness, melancholy in the mind, fevers in the flesh, and restless dreams that wasted the soul's quiet. Medical handbooks of the 16th century, some translated from Latin texts centuries old, described this with calm precision. The physician Andrew Border, whose breviary of health was widely read, advised his readers that abstinence, if overlong, could destroy nature's kindly heat. To purge the body moderately was to maintain vigor, to indulge immoderately was to drain it. Each encounter, therefore, was to be measured like a dose of medicine, enough to ease the humours, but not so much as to unseat them. For men the warning was clear. The body's seed was a precious distillation of the vital spirits, formed from the purest parts of the blood. It was the essence of life, and each emission took from that store. Frequent loss, wrote one Tudor doctor, maketh the limbs feeble, and the face pale. A man who overindulged was thought to hasten his own decline, to age himself before his time, to lose his memory, his steadiness, even his reason. Yet to abstain entirely was equally perilous, for the retained seed could corrupt, turning inward to poison the blood and sour the temper. Moderation was everything, the rhythm of health. Women were not excluded from this logic. Physicians held that the female body, though cooler and moister than the male, produced its own form of seed, and was likewise governed by the same humoral tides. For conception to occur, both seeds must mingle in the womb at the moment of mutual pleasure. Without the woman's delight, her seed would not be drawn forth, and no child could quicken. This idea, curious, half medical, half mythic, lent a strange dignity to female pleasure, not indulgence but necessity. The duty of the husband was therefore not only to sire but to cure, to ensure his wife's health by helping her body fulfill its natural function. Such ideas blurred the lines between medicine and morality. A successful marriage was a form of therapy, a barren one, a diagnosis. When a couple failed to conceive, physicians might prescribe not prayer but regimen, lighter foods, warmer bedding, less wine, more rest, and a renewed marital rhythm. The body, they believed, must be coaxed back into balance before heaven's blessing could descend. Even the timing was prescribed after the evening meal, when the blood was settled and the air temperate, not too near dawn, and never after a day of heavy labour or excess drink. In these instructions one hears not the pulse of romance but the slow ticking of order, the sense that even desire must bow to pattern. Sex was a medicine like any other, and its measure could be charted in the same way as herbs or bleeding. To the Tudors, this gave the act a kind of dignity. It was not shameful, for it belonged to the science of the body, nor was it purely animal, for it served reason and faith alike. It was a small collaboration between human will and divine design, as regular and necessary as the changing of the seasons. The literature of the time spoke with confidence about these matters. Learned men cited Aristotle as easily as scripture. They explained that during the act, the heart's heat increased and the body's vapors rose, purging impurities through sweat and breath. The pulse quickened not as sin, but as symptom. When the act concluded, the cooling of the flesh restored balance once more. Some physicians even prescribed moderate lovemaking to those troubled by sleeplessness or agitation, recommending it as a natural sedative that calmed the humours and invited gentle rest. There was, however, an unspoken boundary. Too much of this medicine could invert its purpose. Excess drained the marrow and loosened the sinews. Repeated indulgence made a man sluggish, distracted, forgetful, symptoms not of pleasure but of decay. The key was self-command, that most English of virtues. Even in the privacy of the bedchamber, the Tudor mind sought restraint, the delicate middle path between neglect and indulgence. To modern eyes, these notions appear tangled and quaint, but in their own way they reveal the quiet rationality of the age. The Tudors saw their bodies as part of a grand design, mechanisms of flesh that responded to rules as sure as those that governed the stars. Every appetite, if rightly ordered, served health. Every excess, if indulged, courted ruin. In that sense, morality and medicine were never far apart. What the preacher called sin, the doctor might call imbalance, and both prescribed the same cure: moderation, reflection, and care of the self. So the chamber became, in its own right, a kind of apothecary. The marital bed was both altar and remedy, a place where the body was tended under the quiet supervision of faith and science. In this dim intersection between desire and discipline, good sex was not only moral but medicinal, an act that cleansed the mind, balanced the humours, and pleased the Creator, who had written such laws into flesh itself. And as physicians penned their treatises and preachers echoed their cautions, another authority prepared to lend its voice. The Church, which had long watched over the body's appetites, ready to define the boundary between healing and sin, between the necessary act and the forbidden excess, between medicine and morality itself. And as physicians penned their treatises and preachers echoed their cautions, another authority prepared to lend its voice. The Church, which had long watched over the body's appetites, ready to define the boundary between healing and sin, between the necessary act and the forbidden excess. In Tudor England, the Church's shadow stretched into every household, every heart, every bedchamber. After Henry VIII's break from Rome, the newly forged Church of England inherited much of its moral architecture from Catholic tradition. Though the throne had changed its allegiance, the human soul and its desires remained bound by the same sacred cautions. Sex, the preachers declared, was the work of God's own hand, created not for corruption, but for creation. It was the means by which families were built and souls multiplied upon the earth. But that same divine gift, if misused, could tip into damnation. From pulpits and confessionals came the steady refrain: within marriage, sex was duty; outside of it, it was sin. Yet even within wedlock, it was to be governed by modesty and reverence. The marital act was not a feast of passion, but a ritual of obedience, an echo of Eden's command, to be fruitful and multiply. A husband who loved his wife rightly did so not in frenzy, but in faith. A wife who yielded did so not in shame, but in virtue. The two became one flesh, not merely in body, but in spirit, fulfilling a covenant sanctified before heaven itself. This idea, preached from cathedral pulpits and humble parish benches alike, placed marriage at the heart of moral order. It was a shield against temptation, a vessel through which natural urges could be purified into lawful purpose. Without it, those urges festered into sin, adultery, fornication, lustful thought, all doors through which the devil was said to enter. In Tudor sermons, lust was not just a private failing, it was a contagion that could corrode the soul and invite divine wrath upon an entire household. The Church's guidance was therefore not to extinguish desire, but to discipline it, to ensure that every touch, every sigh, every union was framed within God's design. Manuals written for married couples urged them to approach their duty with prayer, to avoid carnal excess, and to remember that the body was a temple. Intercourse, they reminded, was not a moment for laughter or vanity, but for gravity and gratitude. Think not of pleasure, one homily warned, but of propagation. Still, for all its solemnity, the Church recognized the frailty of the human creature. Total abstinence was rarely demanded, for even the holiest knew that nature could not be denied forever. St. Paul himself had written that it was better to marry than to burn, a verse Tudor clergymen repeated often, with knowing gravity. Thus the marital bed became both a remedy for lust and a safeguard for virtue. To deny it completely was to risk greater sin. To indulge too freely was to lose self-command. Between those poles lay the narrow road of righteousness, moderation once again, the golden rule of body and soul. In this way, the Church became both physician and judge of human passion. It prescribed union as medicine for temptation, yet censured any hint of pleasure, unmoored from purpose. Confession, where it still lingered in private conscience, was often the place where such contradictions played out. Husbands confessed to lustful thoughts about their own wives. Wives confessed to feeling joy, where they believed they should feel only duty. The Church offered forgiveness, but also warning that even lawful pleasure could become sin if it eclipsed reverence. When Henry VIII declared himself head of the English Church, some imagined that the new faith might ease such strictures. But the reformers, if anything, hardened them. Protestant moralists replaced the rituals of Rome with the rigor of Scripture. The marital act, they preached, must serve not only the body but the household, the orderly governance of husband, wife, and child. To waste seed, to seek pleasure alone, was to defy divine purpose. The Reformation may have unbound the king, but it did not unbind desire. In private, however, ordinary people navigated these expectations with a mix of obedience and quiet humanity. Parish records and court documents reveal that couples sought counsel from both priest and physician when their union faltered. If a wife failed to conceive, or if a husband strayed, church courts could compel reconciliation, demanding that couples resume their conjugal duty, lest abstinence breed temptation. In this sense, the Church's blessing was not only spiritual, but deeply practical. It governed not just the soul, but the rhythm of married life itself. And yet, beneath this structure of duty, something more human stirred. The same preachers who condemned lust also spoke of love, of the harmony between man and woman as a reflection of Christ and his church. A good marriage, they said, was founded on mutual care and trust, not only obedience, and so, even within the careful confines of doctrine, a tenderness grew. The act, once stripped of sin, could be sanctified, not just by purpose but by affection. Still, every sermon carried its warning: pleasure must not become idol. The flesh, though sanctified in marriage, remains suspect, its appetites prone to rebellion. The danger lay not in the act itself, but in the heart's delight, that fleeting moment when desire forgot its duty and reached beyond God's boundary. To yield to lust, even in marriage, was to step towards spiritual peril. The faithful were reminded that Adam and Eve, too, had once acted upon forbidden desire, and the world had never recovered. In the quiet of Tudor nights, then, every union carried the weight of heaven's gaze. The creak of the bedpost, the whisper of breath, the faint sound of prayer, all took place under a moral sky. It was not shame that ruled them, but vigilance, the belief that the sacred and the carnal could coexist, but only so long as reverence held them in balance. And yet, for all the Church's careful guidance, one danger always lingered at the edge of this fragile harmony, a danger older than doctrine and stronger than law: lust itself. For if moderation was the key to godly love, lust was the key that unlocked ruin. It was the forbidden spark, the fever of the blood, that turned duty into desire and sanctity into sin. And the Tudors, ever watchful of their souls, feared its fire more than almost anything else. They feared its fire more than almost anything else. And so, in their vigilance, they began to impose order upon it. If passion was a spark, then discipline was the hearthstone meant to contain it. Then to Tudors, ever watching would nocturne taint. The Tudors, inheritors of ancient medical wisdom and moral restraint, did not leave such matters to chance. For them, even the act of union had its rules, its proper seasons, and its measures of decorum. It was, like all things in the well-governed life, to be guided by time, cleanliness, and order. In an age when the body was seen as a delicate engine of humours, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, every action that stirred it was believed to alter its balance. To eat too much, to drink too deeply, to sleep too little, each could cloud the mind and foul the spirits. So too, the act of sex, potent and draining, was to be approached with caution and preparation. The manuals of the period, heavy with references to Galen and Avicenna, offered detailed advice for those who wished to keep their health, their fertility, and their virtue intact. Cleanliness, they said, was the first condition of good order. Before approaching one's spouse, both husband and wife were encouraged to bathe, or at least wash their faces, hands, and private parts with warm water and linen. It was not only a matter of hygiene, but of moral propriety. To come to the act clean was to show respect for one's partner and for God's creation. Filth, in contrast, was linked with sin and decay. A clean body signaled a clean conscience. Timing, too, mattered greatly. Tudor physicians believed that the body moved in rhythms governed by nature, tides of heat and moisture that rose and fell throughout the day and night. The best time for union, they wrote, was not at random whim, but at the hour when those tides ran most gently. Evening, after a modest supper but before the stroke of midnight, was thought ideal. Then the body's inner fires burned steady but not fierce. Digestion had quieted, and the mind, freed from the noise of daily toil, could rest in composure. Morning, by contrast, was discouraged. The body, they claimed, was still heavy with unpurged vapours, unready for exertion. And never, they warned, after gluttony or wine, for then the humours ran wild, and the act risked deforming the seed or corrupting the blood. Rest was another essential element. Fatigue, physicians warned, was a thief of vitality. Men who worked too hard or stayed up too late were cautioned that their seed would be thin and feeble. Women who were overtired or undernourished were thought to conceive with weakness. And so the wise couple was urged to wait until both were calm in mind and sound in body. Sex, they believed, was not a spontaneous indulgence but a deliberate harmony between two balanced beings, an act that, when rightly timed, could strengthen the constitution, but when rushed could sicken it. The environment, too, was not to be ignored. The chamber should be temperate, neither too warm nor too cold. Excessive heat was thought to inflame the blood, stirring lust and weakening the heart. Cold, on the other hand, could dampen the body's natural vigor and impede conception. The perfect room, the manuals suggested, was dimly lit, free from draughts and perfumed lightly with herbs such as rosemary or lavender, not for seduction but for purity and health. The bed linens were to be clean, the air still, the household asleep. Even sound had its place in the order of intimacy. Silence preserved modesty. Laughter was discouraged as a sign of levity, unbecoming of the act's solemnity. Underlying all this was the belief that moderation was not simply moral but medicinal. The right frequency of union, neither too often nor too seldom, was prescribed like a regimen. Too much, it was said, would drain the life force and dull the senses. Too little would cause melancholy, a heaviness of spirit that could turn to madness. Physicians, always eager to quantify, sometimes advised married men to engage once every 2 weeks in winter, once a week in summer, the warmer months thought to quicken the blood. Women, being cooler in constitution, were said to require less frequent congress, though some writers admitted that their needs were often misunderstood. And then there was the matter of food. What one ate before the act, Tudor doctors insisted, could determine its outcome. Heavy meats, cheese, or ale clouded the body. Fruits, herbs, and a little wine were better. Oysters, almonds, and certain spices were praised for their warming quality, though one was warned never to indulge excessively, lest desire become ungovernable. The meal before union was to be simple, and the heart quiet. To enter the chamber after feast or quarrel was to risk chaos within. All these prescriptions reflected not prudery, but a worldview in which the human body was a mirror of the cosmos, an ordered thing designed to reflect divine balance. Disorder in one part led to disorder in all. Thus sex performed without cleanliness, without rest, without moderation, was seen not merely as unhealthy, but as disobedient to nature's plan. It blurred the sacred symmetry between male and female, heat and coolness, body and soul. For those who followed these rules, good sex was an act of virtue, a practice of self-command and grace. It belonged among the other duties of a well-governed life, prayer, labor, and charity. The goal was not pleasure for its own sake, but peace of body and mind. Even the most private act, in this vision of the world, was part of the great moral architecture of creation, a small echo of divine order repeated in flesh and breath. And yet, for all this attention to timing, temperature, and purity, there remained one element the physicians could not fully measure, the mystery of the woman herself. For in their eyes, she was both partner and vessel, her body an alchemy of secrets that determined not only pleasure, but the continuation of life itself, the mystery of the woman herself, that ancient puzzle that men sought to understand, not through tenderness, but through scripture and science. For in her lay the paradox that most unsettled the Tudor conscience, that love could sanctify, but lust could damn. It was a narrow bridge they walked, these sons and daughters of England's great age. To feel affection was holy, but to feel too much was perilous. Love, they believed, was a virtue, lust, a sickness of the soul. And yet the two shared a language so alike that even the wise could mistake one for the other. The physicians wrote of the humours, the priests of sin, both agreed that passion, if left unchecked, could lead to ruin. The body, they said, was like a furnace, its heat could sustain life or consume it. Thus, the challenge was not to extinguish desire, but to temper it into something higher, love without lust, pleasure without excess, union without surrender. In the dimly lit chambers of Tudor homes, this ideal governed the very rhythm of intimacy. A husband might gaze upon his wife with fondness, but he was cautioned to restrain his body from the wildness of want. A wife, too, might welcome her husband's touch, but only in gentleness, for passion beyond measure was thought to unbalance her humours, to turn warmth into fever, Good sex, in their eyes, was not an act of consumption but of quiet purpose, a confirmation of harmony, duty, and divine design. Thomas Iliot, that learned courtier and moral philosopher, wrote in the book named The Governor, but a husband's love must be grounded in virtue, not appetite. He warned that lust was a tyrant, a force that bringeth man from reason into beastliness. For Iliot and his contemporaries, affection was noble precisely because it required discipline. To desire one's spouse was natural. To be ruled by that desire was dangerous. True love, they said, was steady, moderate, guided by understanding, a friendship sanctified by marriage, not a flame that devoured it. This philosophy permeated even the simplest households. The Church's homilies spoke often of conjugal charity, the idea that marriage was a fellowship of souls as much as bodies. Husbands were to treat their wives as companions in faith, not instruments of pleasure. Wives were to yield not from fear or passion but from duty, trusting that obedience and love were intertwined. In this spiritual arithmetic, lust upset the balance. It turned the holy into the profane, the marital bed into a theatre of sin, and yet, the Tudors were not without tenderness. The letters of ordinary couples, where they survive, reveal affection written in soft tones: "My dear heart, my true comfort, my own sweet wife." But these words existed within a moral frame that demanded restraint. A good husband loved his wife as God loved the Church, with patience, compassion, and order. A good wife returned that love with humility and grace. Passion was to be felt, yes, but quietly, reverently, as one might feel the warmth of a hearth on a winter night, comforting, not consuming. The danger of lust, moralists warned, was its deceit. It could disguise itself as love, slipping into the heart like a thief. Once invited, it clouded reason, drove men to adultery, and led women to ruin. Pamphlets of the time are full of cautionary tales: noblemen undone by desire, maidens shamed by scandal, wives who fell from virtue and lost both soul and standing. In these stories, lust was not a fleeting temptation but a moral contagion, a fever that spread through the household and the community alike. Physicians, too, found evidence of this corruption in the body itself. They claimed that excessive desire could overheat the blood, drain the marrow, and weaken the mind. Men who indulged too often were said to grow pale, thin, and listless, their seed spent, their vigor lost. Women were thought to become restless, melancholic, and prone to wandering of the womb. Thus restraint was preached not only as virtue but as preservation. Chastity was health, lust was decay. The Tudor idea of good sex therefore emerged as something profoundly paradoxical, an act both necessary and perilous, sacred and suspect. It was to be done but never desired too much, enjoyed but only in moderation, blessed but always under the gaze of God. The perfect union was calm, deliberate, without frenzy. In their eyes, the highest pleasure lay in peace, a tranquility that came not from passion's fire, but from its quiet taming. Marriage manuals and sermons described this ideal in gentle but firm terms. Husbands were urged to rule their appetites, to come to their wives not in drunkenness or lust, but in affection and prayer. Wives were counseled to respond with obedience and grace, not vanity or coyness. Together they were to act as stewards of a divine trust, to bring forth life, to support one another, to preserve the dignity of their home. To act otherwise was to invite disorder into the cosmos itself. Even the language of the time reflects this balance. Where we might speak of making love, they spoke of doing one's duty. To know one's spouse was not a euphemism, but a recognition of intimacy's sacred purpose. The union of man and woman was in their view a reflection of divine order, the microcosm of creation itself. To treat it lightly was to mock that order, to abuse it was to defy it, and so the Tudors lived within a framework where affection was encouraged but passion was suspect, where pleasure was permitted but never celebrated. It was a world of quiet glances and measured touch, of affection expressed in restraint. Love was the still pond, lust the storm that disturbed it. To preserve peace within the marriage bed was to preserve peace within the soul. Yet beneath these rules one could still sense an undercurrent, a silent acknowledgement that nature could not always be contained. Even the most disciplined heart might tremble, even the most pious might feel the pull of desire stronger than their prayers. The moralists wrote against it, but the poets, those dangerous interpreters of human truth, whispered otherwise. For while the church demanded love without lust, the poets began to hint that the body and soul might not be so easily divided, and in that quiet defiance they touched upon the one purpose that seemed to unite both realms: fertility. For in Tudor England the measure of good sex was not pleasure, nor even love, but its fruit. The union of man and woman found its justification in the child. A marriage without children was like a candle without flame, a thing incomplete, useful only in potential. The Tudors believed that the health of both soul and body was mirrored in the power to conceive. Fertility was proof that divine favor rested upon a household. Barrenness, by contrast, cast long shadows of doubt. It was not simply misfortune, but an omen, a whisper of imbalance in the body, or worse, in the moral order itself. The language of reproduction was deeply spiritual. To conceive was to participate in God's creation. To fail was to stand outside it. The Church taught that marriage had three ends: mutual comfort, the avoidance of sin, and the procreation of children. Of these the last was the crown. A union that did not bear fruit was often pitied, sometimes pitilessly judged. For if love without lust was a virtue, then love without offspring seemed a waste of divine intention. Medicine, too, lent its authority to this sacred expectation. Tudor physicians, inheriting the doctrines of Galen and Avicenna, explained fertility through the balance of the humours and the alignment of bodily heats. Man, they said, was naturally hot and dry, woman cool and moist. When joined in proper measure, their opposing natures created the perfect medium for life. But when either strayed from balance, when the man's heat was excessive or the woman's body too cold, conception failed. Thus the work of love became, quite literally, the work of equilibrium. Infertility was not yet understood as we know it. Instead, it was interpreted through a mixture of medicine, superstition, and moral scrutiny. A woman who failed to conceive was told her womb might be wandering, a restless organ seeking warmth. A man might be accused of spent seed or choleric excess. In some cases, the blame fell upon witchcraft, a dark interference with nature's order. Neighbors whispered of curses and charms, of midwives who knew too much or herbs that cooled the blood. The line between remedy and sorcery was thin, and desperate couples often walked it without knowing. To restore balance, Tudor physicians prescribed a host of curious remedies. The wife might be instructed to drink wine infused with certain warming spices, cinnamon, nutmeg, saffron, or to bathe her feet in warm milk to draw down the menses. The husband was advised to eat almonds, oysters, or cock's comb, believed to strengthen the seed. Some even recommended gentle riding on horseback to stir the natural heat. Each remedy reflected the same principle, that fertility was a matter of proper temperature and order. Herbal knowledge was often the domain of women, midwives, wisewives, and herbalists who moved quietly between households. They prepared infusions of rue, sage, and pennyroyal to regulate the womb of anise, fennel, and parsley to warm the inward parts. Though their craft was rooted in observation, it was also bound to faith. Many whispered prayers over their mixtures, invoking the Virgin or the saints to bless their work. In this mingling of medicine and devotion lay the true spirit of Tudor healing, half science, half supplication. Even the timing of intercourse was believed to influence conception. Manuals advised couples to unite on certain days after menstruation, when the body's humours were said to be in gentle rising. The moon's phases were observed, its pull thought to govern not only tides but wombs. Some recommended specific positions for the act, claiming that the angle of union could guide the seed to its proper resting place. The advice was given with solemnity, as though divine mathematics governed the mysteries of life. When conception failed despite all effort, suspicion turned inward. Was the husband too cold of temperament? Was the wife too melancholic, her humours dampened by sorrow or sin? Physicians and priests alike urged moderation in diet, in drink, in emotion, for the soul's unrest, they said, could disturb the body's harmony. Anger, envy, and despair were not merely feelings, they were ailments that spoiled the seed and soured the womb. Thus a pious and tranquil heart was itself a form of fertility medicine. Socially, the burden of failure fell most often on women. A barren wife was pitied at best, shunned at worst. In the great houses of England, where lineage meant power, her position could become perilous. The echoes of Henry VIII's court still haunted the age, his desperate quest for a male heir, his rejection of wives who failed to bear him sons. Even ordinary families felt the weight of that precedent. A woman's worth was tied cruelly and completely to her ability to produce life. To fail was to falter not only as wife but as woman. And yet for all their judgments there was tenderness too. Some letters between spouses reveal quiet sorrow, not blame. Husbands prayed for their wives' health. Wives begged for patience and understanding. The church counseled compassion, reminding couples that fruitfulness was in God's hands. But the tension between faith and fear remained. When a child was finally conceived, it was celebrated not merely as a joy, but as a restoration of balance, the proof that nature and virtue were aligned once more. In this way, fertility defined the moral geography of intimacy. It justified desire, sanctified pleasure, and redeemed the act itself. Good sex was, in the end, that which brought forth life, a physical miracle that confirmed the rightness of the union, the blessing of God, and the order of creation itself. Yet behind this reverence for life lay a deeper question, one that even the physicians dared not answer. If fertility was a sign of divine favor, what then of those born outside of it? What of the seed spilled, the womb untouched, the children who came unbidden into the world? For in the quiet alleys and secret chambers of Tudor England, not every act obeyed the rules of order and grace. But even beyond those hidden corners, the Tudors lived in a world where the body itself was a vessel of virtue, an outward reflection of the soul's condition. In this age, the human frame was not regarded as a private possession but as a moral compass, visible, readable, and in constant dialogue with the divine. Every appetite, gesture, and indulgence could be measured not only by its pleasure or pain but by its righteousness. The moral body, as it might be called, was both a spiritual and social instrument, binding individual conduct to the collective conscience. Tudor England, deeply shaped by religion and Renaissance humanism, saw the human form as the seat of order. A healthy, well-governed body mirrored a well-governed mind, and a well-governed mind in turn reflected divine design. To lose control, whether through gluttony, sloth, drunkenness, or lust, was to fall out of alignment with God's will. Thus the act of sex, though natural and even holy within marriage, demanded restraint. It was a duty, but one to be performed with dignity and purpose. Writers of the time, such as William Bulleen in The Government of Health and Andrew Boord in The Breviary of Health, wrote with calm authority on this subject. They treated sex as a necessary function of life, but always within the boundaries of temperance. To indulge excessively was to invite sickness of both body and soul. Keep thy body clean, Bulleen advised, and let thy thoughts be sober, for therein lieth the peace of the flesh. The body in this sense was not merely biological, it was ethical. The Tudor conception of sin was deeply physical. Each of the 7 deadly sins was thought to manifest in the body: pride in posture, envy in the eyes, wrath in the pulse, and lust in the flesh. A person's appearance might betray their inner corruption. Reddened cheeks, trembling hands, or heavy breathing could be read as signs of moral disorder. To be temperate was not just to avoid sin, but to maintain visible calm. Even gestures carried moral weight. The disciplined body was the mark of the virtuous soul. This belief stretched from the pulpit to the physician's chamber. Doctors, drawing upon the ancient humoral system, reinforced the same message as priests. Balance was godliness. Excessive sexual activity, they warned, could overheat the body, thin the blood, and drain vital spirits. Abstaining too long, however, could lead to melancholy and disease. Moderation was the golden rule, the line between piety and peril. Sex, in the Tudor imagination, was not an indulgence of passion, but a practice of self-regulation. The household, too, was organized around this ideal of moral discipline. A husband and wife were expected to maintain order, not only in their home, but in their bodies. The man's control symbolized authority, the woman's modesty represented virtue. Together they formed a miniature kingdom, mirroring the divine and political hierarchies of the world beyond their door. To fail in bodily discipline, to overindulge or to resist one's marital duty, was to risk disorder, both domestic and spiritual. Even the arts reflected this intertwining of body and morality. In Tudor portraiture, the human figure was depicted with solemnity, upright posture, composed hands and restrained expression. Flesh was shown, but never flaunted. The body was to be admired as a creation, not desired as an object. Clothing, too, carried moral significance. A well-dressed figure represented social and spiritual order. Too much display hinted at vanity, the sin of the flesh turned outward. In every aspect, appearance was a statement of virtue, yet beneath these ideals lay quiet contradictions. The same culture that preached restraint also celebrated fertility and marital duty. The same theologians who condemned lust relied upon the act itself to populate their congregations. It was a balance of necessity and denial, of nature and virtue. And so the Tudors lived within a constant negotiation between body and soul, a daily performance of temperance against the ever-present whisper of desire. The human body then was both the battlefield and the prize. Its humours, appetites and urges demanded mastery, but they also defined life itself. To conquer them completely would be to deny one's humanity, to surrender was to forfeit one's morality. Good sex in this paradoxical world was an act of harmony, a joining of flesh that preserved the order of heaven. The moral body stood as the proof of balance achieved, of desire disciplined, and of faith sustained through the most human of acts. It was a delicate equilibrium, and one that not all could maintain. For as physicians and priests prescribed virtue through moderation, others began to wonder whether control could ever truly cleanse the body of its more primal nature. The body, after all, was not just a symbol, it was a living, hungering thing, and its longings often ran deeper than reason dared to follow. And yet, in that quiet acknowledgement of hunger lay one of the most curious paradoxes of Tudor belief, the recognition that women too were designed to desire. It was a truth often whispered more than spoken, cloaked in the language of medicine rather than passion. The physicians of the 16th century, trained in the traditions of Galen and Avicenna, saw the female body not as passive, but as an active partner in conception. Pleasure, they wrote, was not a luxury for women, it was a biological necessity. To conceive, it was said, both man and woman must emit their seed, their bodily essences mingling in perfect harmony. Arousal in this view was not a moral indulgence but a medical requirement. Without delight, the female seed would not flow. Without that flow, the womb would not open to receive the male essence. The result was barrenness. Thus Tudor medicine, though draped in modesty, quietly endorsed a form of equality within the act itself. Both participants, it claimed, must find pleasure if creation was to be complete. This belief was not born of empathy, but of observation filtered through ancient authority. Texts like The Secrets of Women and De Secretis Mulierum treated the female body as a landscape of mystery, to be charted, studied, and above all, controlled. The womb was imagined as a creature of moods, expanding and contracting with emotion, heat, and touch. Its restlessness explained everything from fainting to melancholy. When stirred by desire, it was said to grow warm and fertile. When neglected, it might wander through the body, seeking satisfaction. These ideas, strange as they seem, were shaped by earnest attempts to understand the invisible workings of life. The Tudor mind lived in a world without microscopes or hormones, where the body's secrets were inferred from analogy and faith. The womb, with its cyclical mysteries, became the center of fascination and fear. Physicians described it as the matrix of creation, capable of both life and death. Too much heat could cause corruption, too little could make a woman barren. Pleasure, therefore, was a way of restoring balance, a natural medicine sanctioned by nature itself. Even moralists could not fully deny this doctrine. Though they warned against lust, they conceded that women's pleasure had its rightful place within marriage. The act, when modest and mutual, was a divine mechanism for generation. A husband who neglected his wife's enjoyment was not merely unkind, he was in a sense unwise, for if the female seed did not move, the union failed in its highest purpose. Doctors urged men to be gentle and considerate, to ensure the harmony of humours, lest the child conceived be weak or malformed. In this curious merging of ethics and physiology, kindness became not only virtue but science, and yet, despite this recognition, women's pleasure was never truly celebrated. It was catalogued, managed, and placed within the boundaries of masculine authority. Female sexuality, though vital, was seen as unruly, something that required guidance, lest it lead to chaos. The same physicians who spoke of women's need for delight also warned that excess arousal could provoke hysteria, that too much heat in the womb could turn the body wild. A woman's desire was both necessary and dangerous, a fire to be kindled carefully and contained. The midwives and wise women of the period often understood this better than the scholars. In their private chambers, beyond the reach of university medicine, they treated women's bodies with a mixture of herbal knowledge and empathy. They knew that passion and pain intertwined, that conception was as much emotional as physical. Their remedies, mugwort for fertility, chamomile for calm, rose petals to soothe the womb, reflected a gentler wisdom passed from mother to daughter, outside the gaze of men. But even their knowledge was shadowed by suspicion. The Reformation had begun to shift the moral ground beneath England's feet, and anything that spoke too freely of the body risked being branded unholy. Talk of women's pleasure, even when cloaked in medical terms, was precarious. The Church tolerated such discussions only when tied to marriage and childbirth. To seek pleasure for its own sake was a whisper of Eve's temptation, a dangerous curiosity, an echo of the fall. Thus, the Tudor world moved in contradiction. It affirmed that women's enjoyment was crucial for life, yet forbade women from owning it. It studied their bodies, yet refused them authority over those studies. Pleasure was permitted, but not possessed, necessary yet never entirely safe. Behind the closed doors of marriage, a fragile balance was maintained between duty and delight, medicine and morality, love and restraint. The image of the moral body began to blur here, replaced by something more uncertain. If pleasure could heal, could it also enlighten? Could the body's natural joy be, in its way, divine? Such thoughts were rarely spoken, but they lingered in the margins of texts, in the quiet reflections of women whose voices history has mostly lost. For in the growing shadow of reform and reason, the very language of intimacy began to change. What had once been whispered as natural and necessary would soon be reinterpreted, moralized, politicized, and finally restricted. The body that once promised creation would become a site of suspicion. And as the 16th century moved toward its close, the question of control, who held it, and at what cost, would rise to the surface of English life once again. And as that question deepened, it found its answer not in freedom, but in regulation. For in Tudor England, even the most private act was subject to the rhythms of faith and fear. The body might have been governed by humours, but it was ruled also by the calendar, the church, and the unseen hand of superstition. Sex, though necessary and sanctified within marriage, was not to be indulged at will. There were right times, and there were forbidden times, moments when the body was too close to the sacred or the profane to be safely touched. Holy days stood foremost among these prohibitions. Sundays, feast days and periods of fasting were to be reserved for prayer, not pleasure. To engage in carnal acts during these times was seen as a form of desecration, an intrusion of fleshly appetite into divine worship. The Church had long taught that the Sabbath was a day of rest in all senses, and this extended to the marriage bed. Even the days before major festivals like Easter and Christmas were treated with caution. The devout believed that those who failed to restrain themselves risked not only sin but also ill fortune. Crops might fail, children might fall ill, and the harmony of the household might be disturbed. Equally forbidden were moments when the body itself was considered impure. Menstruation was one such time. Medical theory held that menstrual blood was the body's means of cleansing itself, a process that left a woman's humours unstable and her womb open to corruption. To lie with her during this period was believed to invite sickness, deformity in future children, or even madness. Physicians and priests alike warned against it, blending superstition with science until the two were indistinguishable. The rule was framed as protection of the woman's health, of the husband's vigor, and of the unborn life that might someday result. Pregnancy, too, imposed its own restraint. Once conception occurred, the act that created life was to cease, lest it disturb the fragile order within the womb. The developing child was thought to be sensitive to every motion and mood of its mother. Too much movement, too much heat, too much passion, all were dangers. A pregnant woman was advised to remain calm, eat lightly, and avoid excitement of any kind, including sexual congress. To do otherwise, the midwives warned, might cause the child to be born restless or malformed. It was a fragile balance, one that placed women at the intersection of reverence and restriction. Times of mourning, likewise, demanded abstinence. Grief was a sacred state, a period in which the body and soul were to be turned inward, away from pleasure. To seek physical comfort too soon after a death was seen as not only improper, but dangerous. The spirits of the departed, it was said, lingered near the living for 40 days. To lie together during this time was to invite their envy or wrath, to blur the boundary between the worlds of the living and the dead. In the flicker of a candle or the creak of a bedpost, one might sense the presence of the unquiet dead, disturbed by mortal desire. Underlying all these prohibitions was a single belief that moral impurity and physical imbalance were reflections of the same disorder. Sin could sicken the body, illness could be a sign of spiritual fault. To live rightly was to live healthily, and the rules of the flesh were inseparable from those of the soul. When the Church spoke of chastity, the physician heard equilibrium. When the physician spoke of disease, the priest saw temptation. The boundary between medicine and morality was porous, each lending weight to the other's authority. These customs gave shape to the Tudor household. The rhythms of intimacy were woven into the broader pattern of the year: Lent and Advent, harvest and plague, birth and burial. Even the seasons carried meaning. Spring, with its warming air and rising sap, was thought to favor conception. Winter, cold and damp, counseled restraint. The heavens themselves seemed to participate. Astrologers advised that certain planetary alignments could influence fertility or desire. Mars, too strong, might bring lust without life. Venus, ill-placed, could cloud affection with jealousy. Thus the bedroom became a small reflection of the cosmos, its harmony dependent on celestial and spiritual order alike. And so, through a web of customs, fears, and divine injunctions, the Tudor people learned that the most intimate act was also the most perilous. Every touch carried consequence, every pleasure a price. To obey these rules was to live in balance. To break them was to risk both sin and sickness. Those who defied them, whether out of ignorance, passion, or rebellion, found themselves whispered about in churchyards and taverns alike. A barren marriage, a sickly child, a sudden fever, all could be traced, in the collective imagination, to a night spent in defiance of holy timing. Yet superstition has its own kind of power, one born not only of fear, but of longing. The rules in their rigidity suggested that human desire might somehow disturb the divine order, that the body, by its very nature, carried a spark capable of unsettling heaven itself. It was this uneasy thought, lingering at the edges of doctrine, that gave rise to both reverence and restraint. For to touch was to risk, to desire was to awaken forces beyond comprehension. Still, beneath all the prohibitions, the Tudor heart continued to beat with curiosity. If the church and the physician could dictate when one might love, could they also determine how? Could they measure virtue in the quiet movements of flesh and breath? As the 16th century progressed, such questions began to stir in the minds of those who sought both purity and pleasure, and who wondered, perhaps secretly, if the two were truly opposed. And among those who wondered most were the courtiers, the polished, perfumed men and women who orbited the glittering centers of Tudor power. For them, desire was not abolished but transformed into an art form, controlled, refined, and endlessly performed. The royal court, particularly under Henry VIII and later Elizabeth I, became a theatre where passion was to be displayed, not consumed, a place where the appearance of restraint was itself erotic. In this carefully choreographed world, chastity was the highest form of sophistication. To be visibly virtuous was to command admiration, for the court prized composure as much as beauty. A blush could be more provocative than a kiss, a glance more daring than a touch. Love, expressed through verse and music, through dance and courtly exchange, existed at a deliberate remove from the body. To reveal too much longing was vulgar, to master it was divine. The ideals that shaped this culture drew heavily from the Renaissance revival of classical thought, from Plato's vision of idealized love, purified of bodily desire, and from Petrarch's verses that placed devotion on a pedestal just out of reach. In Tudor England, this philosophy merged with Christian morality to create a unique moral theatre. One could praise beauty, adore virtue, and even confess love, so long as it remained cloaked in elegance. The act of restraint became both moral discipline and social strategy. Henry VIII's early court was a stage of flirtation and poetry. Courtiers competed in writing verses, songs, and masques that hinted at longing but never surrendered to it. Women of rank, adorned in silks and jewels, moved like living metaphors of chastity, unattainable, admired, and powerful in their inaccessibility. The king himself, with his alternating passions and reforms, embodied the contradiction, a man torn between the chivalric cult of pure love and the earthy realities of desire. His court shimmered with the tension between piety and pleasure, restraint and indulgence. Under Elizabeth I, this culture of restraint reached its most elaborate form. The Virgin Queen crafted her public image around the fusion of power and purity. Her body, both literal and symbolic, became the focus of endless adoration. Courtiers knelt before her as before an untouchable goddess. Yet within this devotion there pulsed an unmistakable erotic undercurrent. To love the Queen was to enter into a sacred paradox. The lover's passion was elevated precisely because it could never be fulfilled. In this way, chastity itself became the source of desire. The language of the Elizabethan court was charged with such sublimation. Poets like Sir Philip Sidney and Edmund Spenser filled their verses with longing transfigured into virtue. Their heroines, Stella, Una, Belphoebe, were embodiments of idealized restraint. Each line of verse became a gesture of controlled affection, an offering to beauty disciplined by reason. Even in court dances where gloved hands brushed and eyes met across the space of formality, every movement was a study in balance, desire confined within decorum, passion disguised as grace. Behind these performances, however, lay a strict moral code. Adultery, seduction, or open displays of lust could destroy reputations and careers. The court was a web of observation, where whispers traveled faster than truth. A single indiscretion could end in exile or ruin. Women in particular navigated this world with perilous care, balancing the expectation of charm with the necessity of chastity. To appear too cold was to seem proud, too warm, and one risked scandal. The art of courtly life was above all, the art of appearing perfect. This discipline of desire was not merely social but spiritual. To master the passions was to mirror divine order, just as to govern one's household or kingdom required self-control. Erotic restraint, therefore, was both aesthetic and moral, a proof of intellect, a sign of virtue. In the rare moments when this control failed, when gossip hinted at secret liaisons or hidden pregnancies, the scandal was not only personal but cosmic. It disturbed the harmony of the realm. For in the Tudor imagination, the body of the monarch and the moral body of the nation were one, and yet the very tension that defined this world also sustained it. The poems, the masks, the glances across candlelit halls all drew their power from what was withheld. The absence of fulfillment became the source of beauty. An unspoken longing gave life to the culture's most refined art. Desire, when contained, illuminated the court like fire behind glass, safe, admired, but still capable of burning. It was this delicate balance between temptation and virtue, performance and truth, that gave Tudor court life its peculiar brilliance. The courtiers, adorned in jewels and silks, moved like actors on a sacred stage, every gesture rehearsed, every sigh deliberate. But beneath the surface, the human heart still beat its old restless rhythm. For all their polished restraint, they were not untouched by longing. They were merely trained to conceal it. And as the centuries would later reveal, such restraint could not last forever. The coded language of desire, once confined to poems and masks, would begin to loosen, to find new forms of expression. But before that transformation could come, Tudor England would continue to live in its shimmering paradox, where chastity was worshipped, desire was feared, and every heart at court learned the dangerous art of loving without touch. Beyond the candlelit courts, where passion hid behind poetry, the larger rhythm of Tudor life unfolded in quieter, steadier forms. Most people lived not in palaces, but in farmhouses and towns, in homes where virtue was measured less by wit than by order. Here, the model of good sex was not found in flirtations of courtiers, but in the printed pages of marriage manuals, books that promised to teach husbands and wives how to live in harmony, and in doing so, to please both God and nature. Among the most influential of these guides were the Book of Husbandry and the Gurner, though differing in audience, one directed toward the practical management of rural life, the other to the education of gentlemen. Both shared a vision of the well-ordered household as the foundation of moral society. Within this vision, marriage was not merely a private union, but a microcosm of divine and civic order. Each role, like each cog in a clock, had its purpose, and when each fulfilled that purpose rightly, harmony was achieved. The husband stood at the center of this order, imagined as the rational head of the domestic body. He was to lead with wisdom, restraint, and virtue, ensuring the balance of both spiritual and physical life within his home. The wife, by contrast, was portrayed as the heart, obedient, modest, and nurturing, her duty bound to the quiet governance of daily care. This hierarchy, though strict, was presented not as tyranny but as natural law, a reflection of celestial harmony. Just as the heavens revolved in measured order, so too should the household. Within this moral geometry, sexuality was neither dismissed nor celebrated. It was absorbed into the pattern of duty. A husband's authority extended to the marriage bed, but it was an authority tempered by responsibility. Manuals reminded him that his wife was not a servant of his pleasure, but a companion in divine purpose. Excess, even within marriage, was frowned upon. To indulge without restraint was to fall into the sin of lust, which could in time corrupt not only the soul, but the body itself. Moderation, therefore, was both moral and medical, the foundation of a good marriage. For wives, the ideal was modesty, not coldness, but composure. The perfect wife was imagined as one who approached her duties, including those of intimacy, with quiet grace. She was to yield not from desire, but from obedience, to give herself as an act of love guided by reason, rather than passion. Writers of the time spoke often of the virtue of silence, a woman's word measured, her demeanor calm. To speak too freely, or laugh too loudly, was thought indecorous, and by extension, dangerous to marital order. These ideals were not confined to theory, they were preached from pulpits, repeated in sermons, and reinforced in law. The household, after all, was seen as the seed of the kingdom. A well-governed home promised a well-governed nation. The sexual harmony of husband and wife mirrored the political harmony between ruler and subject, each obedient in their proper place, each contributing to the stability of the whole. Disorder in the bedchamber, then, could be read as disorder in the state. Yet beneath this serene vision lay human contradiction. Not every marriage followed the manual's careful prescriptions. Many couples struggled to balance affection and duty, love and authority. For some, obedience felt less divine than imposed. Records from ecclesiastical courts reveal quarrels, accusations, and separations, reminders that even in an age of order, emotion was rarely obedient. But these guides endured precisely because they offered reassurance, a structure against the unpredictability of human desire. The language of these texts often blurred the line between spiritual and physical discipline. To keep a tidy home was to cleanse the soul. To approach the marriage bed with decorum was to preserve moral health. Sexual acts themselves were described in terms of purpose and moderation, a means of fulfilling divine instruction, not of seeking pleasure for its own sake. In this sense, good sex became part of a moral economy, something to be managed, measured, and justified through its contribution to harmony. This idea, that the body's impulses must be governed by reason, echoed the broader humanist currents of the Renaissance. Just as scholars sought to order knowledge and statesmen to order the realm, so too did moralists seek to order desire. The Tudor household thus became a training ground for virtue, a place where the private met the cosmic. Every act, even the most intimate, had significance. Every gesture was part of a greater choreography of order and restraint. Still, within this system of control, affection was not absent. Manuals spoke of kindness, mutual care, and even delight, but always framed within the boundaries of duty. Love was best when it reflected stability, not passion, when it nurtured rather than consumed. A husband's touch was to be gentle, a wife's affection steady. Their union was to produce not only children but virtue, to transform natural instinct into moral beauty. As the years passed, these ideas shaped generations of households. The Tudor home became a stage upon which theology, medicine, and social order performed in unison. Even the simplest acts, the setting of a table, the sharing of a meal, the closing of a bedchamber curtain, were imbued with quiet significance. For in the Tudor imagination, the moral life was never separate from the physical one. Each moment of restraint, each gesture of obedience, reaffirmed the divine pattern that linked heaven and hearth. And so, as the candlelight faded across countless Tudor chambers, the hum of order persisted. Behind every drawn curtain, there was not the wildness of passion but the calm rhythm of duty. A world where harmony was holiness, and every touch, when measured rightly, was a prayer in motion. Yet even within that carefully tended order, the shadow of sin lingered, long, patient, and watchful. For the Tudors, no act of the body was free from the eye of God, and no thought escaped the reach of conscience. The Reformation may have shattered the authority of Rome, but it did not dissolve the moral weight that pressed upon the soul. If anything, it deepened it. Without confession to a priest, the believer was left alone before God, naked in thought and deed. The bedroom, once guarded by ritual and penance, became a private chapel of its own, a place where conscience whispered louder than desire. In this world, the boundaries of sin were as intricate as lace. Adultery and fornication were not merely private indiscretions. They were wounds upon the moral fabric of the realm. Both church and state agreed on their gravity. The ecclesiastical courts, those vast bureaucratic engines of moral supervision, heard countless cases in which neighbors testified to the failings of others. A sigh overheard, a pregnancy too soon, a glance too long, all could become evidence of sin. Public reputation and divine favor were inseparable. To fall from one was to endanger the other. The law, too, tightened its hold. Adultery, once left largely to ecclesiastical judgment, could bring legal consequence, especially among the upper classes where property and lineage were at stake. Fornication before marriage was met with fines, penance, or corporal punishment. In some parishes, offenders were made to stand barefoot before the congregation, wrapped in a white sheet, a living sermon of repentance. The body that had sinned became the site of its own correction. This moral surveillance reflected a deeper anxiety that disorder in private life might spill outward into social chaos. Tudor England was, in many ways, an experiment in control, of faith, of behaviour, of the restless human will. The Reformation had replaced priests with preachers, confessionals with sermons, but the need to regulate desire remained. The pulpit thundered where once the confessional had whispered. Sermons against lechery and impurity filled the air of parish churches, warning that sin, though hidden in darkness, was seen by the eyes of heaven. For the Tudors, sin was not simply a moral flaw, but a contagion. It could spread through households, through towns, through the very body of the nation. A husband's infidelity might bring divine judgment upon his home. A woman's uncleanness might blight her family's fortune. The moral imagination of the time was communal. Every act of transgression disturbed the delicate balance of grace that bound society together. It was this conviction that justified the public nature of punishment. Penance was not only for the sinner's soul, but for the edification of all who watched. And yet, for all its severity, the Tudor understanding of sin was also profoundly physical. The body was the battlefield where virtue and corruption met. To resist temptation was to strengthen the soul. To yield was to risk both damnation and disease. Physicians and preachers alike warned of the dangers of excessive emission, of passions that drained life and reason alike. The vocabulary of sin and sickness intertwined until they were nearly indistinguishable. Lust weakened not only faith but flesh. Moderation, therefore, was both cure and creed. Private guilt, however, could not always be contained by public penance. The break from Rome had removed the sacrament of confession, but not the human need for absolution. People sought new ways to unburden the conscience, through prayer, through self-examination, through the whispered counsel of ministers. Religious tracts encouraged believers to search the heart each night before sleep, to recall their failings and seek forgiveness in solitude. The moral life became an inward discipline, a daily reckoning between the individual and the divine. For women in particular, the stakes of sin were perilous. Their virtue was not merely moral but economic, bound to dowries, inheritances, and alliances. A woman's reputation for chastity was her currency. Once lost, it was rarely restored. Tales of fallen women haunted Tudor literature, warnings disguised as pity. They were lessons in the cost of disobedience. For men too, the body was a test of discipline, but society forgave their transgressions more readily. The double standard, though unspoken, was visible in every law and sermon. What made this moral landscape most potent, however, was its intimacy. The notion of divine surveillance, that every thought and gesture was known to God, created an atmosphere of quiet vigilance. Even in the stillness of night, when shutters were drawn and candles dimmed, the conscience stirred. Acts of passion, if they strayed from order, left an aftertaste of guilt. The Tudor imagination did not separate pleasure from peril. Each was the mirror of the other. To experience desire was to court danger, to awaken forces that could lead either to life or ruin. It was this sense of moral precariousness that gave Tudor sexuality its tension, the simultaneous presence of restraint and temptation. Good sex was defined less by feeling than by alignment with divine will. It was not simply what happened between two bodies, but what it signified within the cosmic order. Every embrace had the potential to echo eternity, for good or ill, and every act of disobedience, however secret, was believed to tilt the balance between grace and judgment. The confessional world that once allowed the sinner to whisper their transgressions into darkness had been replaced by a public theatre of repentance. The parish became the stage, the congregation its audience, the minister its moral arbiter. The Tudor soul lived in constant performance, not of passion but of penitence. What was once private had become profoundly communal. And yet, even under such watchful eyes, humanity endured. Couples still found warmth in one another. Desire still threaded through the moral fabric like a hidden embroidery. The boundaries set by law and faith did not extinguish longing, they only changed its shape. The same world that punished sin also sanctified union. The same sermons that condemned lust celebrated the purity of marital love. In this contradiction, Tudor sexuality found its uneasy balance between flesh and spirit, indulgence and obedience, guilt and grace. Thus, the act that bound husband and wife in physical closeness remained tethered to a larger invisible structure of divine judgment. To lie together was to lie beneath the gaze of eternity. And as the candle's flame trembled against the chamber wall, even the purest union carried a shadow, the quiet reminder that in Tudor England, pleasure was never free from conscience, and love itself was a discipline of the soul. As the century advanced and England settled uneasily into its new Protestant identity, a quieter revolution unfolded beneath the surface, one not of kings or creeds, but of knowledge itself. The Tudor mind, steeped in faith yet newly curious about the mechanisms of the world, began to turn its gaze inward. The body, long seen as the vessel of sin and virtue, was now also the subject of study. In this world of mingled scripture and science, the anatomy of man and woman became not a source of shame but of revelation, the handiwork of a divine craftsman, whose design invited contemplation. For Tudor physicians and natural philosophers, the study of sex was never detached from theology. God, they believed, had written his will into the very structure of flesh. To understand the body, then, was to read another form of scripture, a text inscribed not on parchment, but in bone, sinew, and seed. The idea of procreation, once confined to the sphere of moral duty, took on a new significance as both spiritual act and natural process. Physicians such as Thomas Vicary, author of The Anatomy of the Body of Man 1548, saw the human form as evidence of divine perfection. Every vein, every organ, served purpose and order, reflecting the same harmony that governed the heavens. In this world of mingling ideas, good sex remained a moral concern, but it also became a subject of medical curiosity. Scholars inherited the frameworks of Galen and Aristotle, systems of humours, elements and natural balances, yet they now interpreted them through the lens of divine intention. The heat of the male, the moisture of the female, the union of opposites, all were part of a cosmic logic in which generation mirrored creation itself. When man and woman came together, it was believed, they reenacted the balance of nature and fulfilled the divine command to be fruitful and multiply. Religious scholars, too, took interest in this intersection. Preachers and moral writers drew upon medical thought to reinforce their sermons. They warned that neglect of one's natural function, through abstinence, gluttony, or indulgence, disturbed not only health, but the moral order. The body's processes, in their view, were instruments of divine will. To live rightly was to live in accord with the design of one's flesh, to recognize that reason ruled appetite just as God ruled creation. Yet this blending of science and scripture created its own paradox. The more closely scholars studied the body, the more they risked confronting its material truth, and that truth, in all its earthy complexity, was difficult to reconcile with spiritual ideals. Anatomists who dissected corpses in the name of learning sometimes faced moral suspicion, for to open the body was to trespass on holy ground. And yet, even as the Church warned against curiosity, it could not suppress it entirely. The Reformation's emphasis on reading and personal understanding encouraged inquiry, not only of the Bible, but of the world. The Tudor physician thus occupied a delicate position, half healer, half theologian. He was expected to preserve life, to balance the humours and ease the passions, but also to remind his patients that the ultimate source of health lay in divine favour. When treating matters of fertility or sexual function, he spoke the languages of both medicine and morality. A man weakened by excessive heat, or a woman overburdened by moisture, might receive prescriptions of diet, rest and herbs, but also admonitions against sin. For in this worldview, The failure of the body often mirrored the failure of the soul. This dual perspective shaped the language of sex itself. Terms like seed, nature, and generation carried both biological and spiritual weight. To spill seed in vain was not merely wasteful, but sinful. To engage in marital union was to participate in divine creation. The act of procreation was at once a physical transaction and a sacred duty, a cooperation between flesh and spirit, man and God. Even pleasure, cautiously acknowledged, was interpreted as a byproduct of divine design. It was said that God made the act pleasurable, not as temptation, but as incentive, a gentle nudge toward the fulfillment of his command. As printing expanded and literacy spread, medical and moral texts began to circulate beyond the learned few. Works on anatomy, physiology, and moral conduct found their way into merchant households and provincial studies. The result was a gradual democratization of knowledge, one that carried both enlightenment and anxiety. The secrets of the body, once cloistered behind monastery walls, were now subject to public curiosity. And with each new diagram, each new description of veins and wombs, the mystery of sex grew at once more illuminated and more complicated. Among the most influential of these texts was The Secrets of Women, a compilation of medieval medical lore that persisted well into the Tudor period. It blended observation with allegory, anatomy with morality. The womb was described as a vessel of life, but also as a moral symbol, its openness or closure reflecting the purity of its possessor. Even as writers sought to explain conception, they could not fully separate their science from their scripture. Each discovery, each description of the flesh was shadowed by reverence. The interplay of faith and reason gave Tudor sexuality its distinctive texture, neither wholly sacred nor entirely profane. The body was a map of divine design, yet also a source of endless caution. Physicians warned that misuse of one's natural faculties could lead not only to physical decline, but to spiritual corruption. Lust remained a moral danger, but now it was also a physiological imbalance, a fever of the soul and the flesh alike. To cure it was to restore both order and grace. And so, the Tudor understanding of sex evolved in quiet complexity. No longer seen only through the stained glass of sin, it began to take shape as part of nature's great mechanism, a system of balances, cycles, and purposes. The seed and the womb, the pulse and the breath, became metaphors of divine wisdom, the visible proof that creation was ongoing. In every act of union, the Tudors saw a reflection of God's hand, the mingling of the earthly and the eternal, science and scripture intertwined like vines around the same ancient truth. The world was changing, though few yet grasped how deeply. The questions that began with the humours would soon lead to anatomy, and from anatomy to philosophy, until the sacred and the scientific no longer stood as allies, but as rivals. But for now, in the soft twilight of the 16th century, the Tudors dwelt in a rare balance, believing that to know the body was to praise its maker, and that every heartbeat, every joining, was both a natural wonder and a silent act of worship. By the time Elizabeth I ascended the throne in 1558, the long and turbulent journey of Tudor morality had come to rest under a new kind of order, one wrapped in symbolism, silence, and restraint. The age that bore her name would become synonymous with prudence, decorum, and self-command. The Virgin Queen's very body became the mirror of national virtue, her chastity both political emblem and moral compass. Around her image, the ideals of restraint gathered and solidified, shaping how a nation thought about love, duty, and the secret life of the flesh. To speak of Elizabeth was to speak of purity. Painters encased her in pearls and silver, symbols of untarnished virtue. Poets described her as Diana, the chaste huntress, or Astrea, the celestial virgin descended to earth. This cultivated image was not mere flattery, it was policy. In a kingdom that had endured decades of religious conflict, Elizabeth's celibacy became a symbol of unity, a body unclaimed, belonging to none but England itself. Her virginity, though deeply political, carried immense moral weight. It set the tone for her reign and for the culture that grew beneath it. a culture that elevated chastity into civic virtue. In this climate, sexuality retreated further from public view. It was not denied but refined, folded quietly into the language of poetry, conduct, and allegory. The same physicians and preachers who once debated the balance of humours now spoke of temperance, discretion, and inward discipline. The act of self-control, once a private moral endeavour, became a national performance. To be prudent was to be English. To be wanton was to be disorderly, foreign, even dangerous. Yet beneath this varnish of virtue, the old beliefs persisted. In households across the realm, couples still relied on the humoral logic of health, the rhythms of the moon, and the counsel of midwives. Fertility remained both hope and anxiety, the measure of a household's success. Medical tracts circulated in modest volumes, advising on the proper times and methods for conception. The same formulas that guided the early Tudors, balance of heat and moisture, moderation of appetite, harmony between partners, remained in quiet use. Religion might dictate morality, but medicine still whispered its practical truths. The average Elizabethan lived in a world where the private body was shadowed by public expectation. In towns and parishes, gossip served as moral surveillance. A woman's reputation was a fragile possession, easily stained and rarely restored. Marriage, though sanctified, remained a social contract, a careful negotiation between duty and desire. To marry well was to balance affection with prudence, the heart with the ledger. Passion, when it existed, was tempered by the ever-present reminder of God's gaze and society's judgment. Elizabeth's reign encouraged this moderation, not through coercion but by example. The Queen's unmarried state transformed chastity into a kind of patriotic discipline. Writers like Edmund Spenser, in his Fairy Queen, cast purity as strength, depicting chaste knights and virtuous maidens as the moral anchors of a divine order. Even in popular ballads and sermons, the theme of restraint echoed again and again. Virtue was stability, and stability was the lifeblood of the realm. The nation itself was imagined as a body, healthy only when its appetites were controlled. Yet prudence did not erase curiosity. Beneath the polished surfaces of Elizabethan morality, there flickered a restless fascination with love and desire. The very poetry that praised chastity often lingered on its edges. Courtly verses spoke in riddles, their innocence laced with innuendo. The theatre, newly thriving, became a mirror to this tension. On Shakespeare's stage, the battle between reason and passion played out endlessly. Juliet's yearning against her family's code, Othello's jealousy against his honor, Angelo's hypocrisy against Isabella's virtue. The audience, bound by their own moral restraints, recognized in these dramas the quiet struggles of their own hearts. The Queen herself embodied this paradox. Her court was a place of elegance and repression, of elaborate rituals that concealed the rawness of human feeling. Her favourites, Leicester, Essex, Raleigh, flattered her with gallantry that hovered between adoration and desire, yet always stopped short of transgression. Elizabeth encouraged this dance of devotion, understanding that it reinforced her power. She was the unattainable centre around which the ambitions and passions of men revolved. In her restraint lay both her authority and her allure. For common folk, such restraint took humbler forms. The Church's teachings on modesty remained stern, and the parish continued to police behaviour through both law and shame. Adultery could lead to penance or ruin. Bastardy was punished not only by moral condemnation, but by economic hardship. Still, human nature found its ways. Secret liaisons, hurried marriages, and whispered scandals threaded through village life as they always had. The difference was that now, more than ever, these acts carried the weight of national morality. To sin was not only to offend God, but to betray the example set by the Queen herself. In this way, Elizabethan prudence did not extinguish desire. It ritualized it. Chastity became a performance, modesty a form of art. Women adorned themselves in high collars and long sleeves, yet fashion itself was sensual in its suggestion of what lay hidden. Men boasted of honor, yet wrote verses that trembled with longing. The culture of restraint, paradoxically, heightened awareness of what it suppressed. Desire, confined and disciplined, grew more intricate, finding expression in music, poetry, and ceremony. And so the Elizabethan world moved in a delicate balance, outwardly serene, inwardly restless. Science continued its cautious exploration of the body. The Church preserved its vigilance over the soul. The Queen's virtue stood as both shield and mirror, reflecting the hopes and anxieties of her people. Beneath her steady gaze, England learned to equate self-control with civilization, modesty with strength, prudence with power. But even as her image endured, cracks began to form in the illusion. The coming generations would inherit a world no longer content with silence. The same curiosity that once revered divine design would soon begin to question it. The human body, so long a vessel of morality, would become a field of inquiry, measured, mapped, and finally liberated from the language of sin. Yet for the Elizabethans this future was still unimaginable. For them the Virgin Queen's virtue was not myth, but mirror, a reflection of what they aspired to be: disciplined, dignified, and devout. Their nights remained governed by the same rhythms of duty and faith, their marriages guided by order, and their desires softened by prayer. And as the candles burned low in countless English chambers, one could imagine that same quiet refrain echoing across the kingdom, that to be pure was to be strong, and to be strong was to be English. Beyond the polished halls of Elizabeth's court and the austere sermons of parish pulpits, life in Tudor England followed its own rhythms, earthbound, cyclical, and quietly enchanted. In the cottages of common folk, the body and the spirit were still tethered to the soil and to the seasons. For all the moral instruction that poured from the church, people trusted in older wisdom, the whisper of herbs, the rhythm of planting and harvest, the unseen forces of air and moonlight that shaped both crops and conception. In this quieter, humbler world, the idea of good sex found expression not in scripture or science, but in superstition and folk ritual. Fertility was a shared preoccupation, a concern not of pleasure alone but of survival. A child meant another set of hands in the field, another heir to hold the family's small patch of land. Thus, every union carried hope and anxiety. When months passed without pregnancy, couples turned not only to midwives or physicians, but to village healers, women who kept in their memories the old recipes of the countryside. They knew which roots to steep, which herbs to burn, and when to time their counsel according to the moon's phases. Rosemary was the herb of remembrance, but it was also believed to quicken the blood and stir affection. Rue, bitter and strong, was used with care, a purifier, thought to banish evil influences and cleanse the womb. Oysters, too, found their way into Tudor lore, symbols of vitality and fertility, though few among the rural poor could afford them. More often, couples shared wine, sweetened with honey or spiced with cinnamon, both thought to warm the body and enliven the spirits. These rituals were rarely seen as sinful. The Tudors lived in a world where magic and medicine intertwined without contradiction. A charm whispered over a cup, or a prayer said at dawn, was merely another way to invoke divine favor. The church might frown upon superstition, but most villagers drew little distinction between blessing and spell. The natural world was a web of divine intention. Every plant and stone carried a purpose placed there by God. To use them wisely was not heresy, it was piety in practice. In some regions, women tied ribbons around their waists or wore sprigs of fennel at weddings, believing these would protect fertility and ensure a fruitful union. Midwives, often half feared and half revered, carried amulets against the evil eye, muttering Latin fragments learned generations ago. On Midsummer's Eve, young women slipped flowers beneath their pillows, hoping to dream of the man they would marry. These customs, inherited from medieval times, lingered well into the late Tudor period, woven into the fabric of ordinary life. The influence of astrology, too, was strong. The alignment of stars and planets was thought to affect not only fortune but the success of conception. Almanacs circulated widely, filled with tables showing the best times for sowing seeds, bleeding patients, or begetting children. The moon's course was to be observed carefully, waning phases discouraged, waxing ones welcomed. Even among the learned this belief endured. Physicians sometimes consulted astrological charts before prescribing remedies or setting auspicious days for marriage. The heavens and the human body mirrored one another, both governed by divine geometry. The notion of sexual balance, so central to humoral medicine, took on a rustic form in folklore. It was said that too much heat in the body led to desire unchecked, while too much coldness bred indifference. To restore balance, people sought warmth in spices, baths, or strong ale. Honey was prized as a gift from the bees of Eden, a symbol of sweetness and fertility. To share honeyed cakes at a wedding was to wish the couple a union as fruitful as summer. Thus the word honeymoon, though not yet widely used, carried both sweetness and superstition. These country customs often coexisted with strict moral boundaries. Even as the church wardens preached chastity, villagers traded, knowing smiles over herbal tonics, or exchanged charms in secret. Such practices reflected a simple truth. While theology sought purity, life required pragmatism. The line between sin and necessity blurred where survival was concerned. A barren marriage could bring shame and economic hardship. Thus, seeking aid from herbs or charms was rarely condemned outright, provided it was done within wedlock. For unmarried lovers, the matter was more delicate. A charm or potion used for seduction rather than conception veered close to witchcraft in the eyes of the law. Indeed, some of the earliest accusations of sorcery in Tudor England involved claims of love spells, powders slipped into ale, knots tied in hair, prayers turned toward manipulation rather than blessing. The same folk wisdom that healed and nurtured could, when misused, condemn. Still, in most homes these practices were gentle, almost domestic in their simplicity. A mother passed her knowledge to her daughter. A neighbor shared a recipe for strengthening a weak husband. A midwife whispered blessings over the cradle. It was a world of quiet remedies, carried by memory rather than manuscript. In this sense, Tudor sex was not only a moral or medical matter, but a communal one, bound to the rhythms of the earth, the turning of the seasons, and the cycles of human life. By twilight, when the fields were silent and the hearth glowed with the last embers of the day, such beliefs felt as natural as the settling dusk. The air itself seemed to hum with old truths, that love was both work and worship, that the body was an instrument of divine order, and that the smallest herb might hold the blessing of a future child. The Tudors did not speak of desire as we do. They felt it as part of the same pulse that moved through nature, neither shameful nor sacred, but simply necessary. And as these humble customs endured, they wove a bridge between the learned and the lay, the sacred and the profane. For though the queen might embody restraint and the physician might speak of humours, it was in the cottages and gardens of England that the true art of balance was practiced. The slow, enduring belief that harmony between man, woman and earth was the essence of good life, and, in its own quiet way, of good love. As the Tudor age deepened, curiosity began to take firmer root. Beneath the weight of tradition, a quiet shift stirred, not yet science as the modern mind would recognize it, but a careful, reverent study of the human body. Physicians, many of them educated at Oxford, Cambridge, or on the continent, began to record the private ailments of their patients with new attentiveness. Their notes and treatises, filled with the language of humours and vapours, reveal a society still bound to medieval theory, yet reaching cautiously toward empirical understanding. In these pages, sex appeared not as sin or mystery, but as physiology, a process to be balanced, regulated, and when necessary, repaired. The human body was imagined as a system of channels and flows, its health determined by the movement of heat and moisture. When desire faltered, when a husband grew listless or a wife unresponsive, physicians did not speak of vice but of imbalance. They described coldness of the loins, melancholy of the seed, and retention of vapours, terms that sought to give order to the hidden machinery of pleasure. Impotence, for example, was often attributed to an excess of cold or moisture in the body, particularly in the liver and genitals. The remedy was warmth, literal and metaphorical. Physicians advised the taking of spiced wine, the eating of almonds, figs, and eggs, and the wearing of flannel undergarments to preserve inner heat. Exercise was praised for stirring the blood, while idleness was condemned as the enemy of vitality. The same principles applied to women. Those of cold temperament were thought less inclined to desire or fertility, while those of hot disposition were said to be prone to passion or disorder. To restore harmony, doctors prescribed baths infused with rosemary, sage, or marjoram. Perfumed oils of musk or civet were massaged into the skin, both medicine and sensual indulgence. The language of healing was steeped in tact. These were private matters discussed in Latin, shielded by decorum. Yet beneath the modest phrasing lay a deep fascination with the intimate workings of the body. Every ailment, every cure, became part of a broader effort to understand how flesh and spirit intertwined. The humoral theory, though ancient, provided a reassuring logic. It explained everything: temperament, desire, fertility, even morality. A choleric man ruled by yellow bile and heat might be quick-tempered but vigorous in love. A phlegmatic one, dominated by cold and moisture, might be gentle but slow to passion. The sanguine were merry and amorous, the melancholic pensive and restrained. These categories, drawn from Galen and refined by centuries of commentary, gave Tudor people a way to map the landscape of the body and the emotions it carried. Medical writers of the time, such as Andrew Borde, physician and sometime monk, compiled their observations in books that blended advice on diet, hygiene, and sexuality. Borde's Compendious Regiment, or a Dietary of Health 1542, suggested that moderation in food and drink preserved both health and marital harmony. Too much wine or heavy meat was thought to dull the senses, too little nourishment to weaken the seed. Good sex, by this reasoning, was not merely a moral or emotional matter, but a physiological one, an outcome of proper living. There was also a growing interest in what might today be called psychosomatic conditions. Physicians began to note that sadness, worry, or fear could manifest as physical impotence or infertility. Melancholy of the spirit, one writer observed, doth chill the blood and bind the seed. Conversely, joy and ease were said to open the body's channels, making conception more likely. The mind and body, in this view, were partners in health. Thus even the sternest doctor might quietly recommend affection, laughter, or gentle company as part of a cure. Women's ailments, too, were catalogued with particular attention, though always through a male lens. The wandering womb, an ancient notion that the uterus could move within the body and cause hysteria, still held sway. Treatments included scented oils, fumigations, and the use of warmth to draw down the womb to its proper place. Physicians believed that regular sexual activity within marriage helped to keep women healthy by allowing the retention and release of seed in balance. To be barren was not only a misfortune but a medical puzzle, one that blended anatomy, astrology, and divine will. The Tudor household thus became, in its way, a small laboratory of health. Remedies for frigidity, barrenness, and melancholy circulated in recipe books, alongside instructions for brewing ale or preserving fruit. A wife might steep dried figs in wine to make the blood runneth freely, while a husband might rub his temples with oil of nutmeg to stir up the spirits. These practices bridged medicine and intimacy, turning care into ritual. Even within this curiosity, there lingered restraint. Physicians wrote of desire as one might write of digestion, necessary, natural, but requiring moderation. Excessive intercourse, they warned, could drain the vital forces, leaving the body weak, pale, and slothful. Moderation was again the key, the same balance that governed every aspect of Tudor life. Passion uncontrolled led not only to sin but to sickness. Temperance preserved both soul and body, ensuring that pleasure served health rather than defied it. And yet, in these careful writings, one senses a subtle fascination, a willingness to look beyond dogma into the mechanics of human experience. The same hand that recorded fevers and fluxes now recorded the ebb and flow of desire. The physician became a quiet observer of the most private acts of his age, translating them into the language of nature and necessity. Through him, the Tudor world took one step closer to understanding the self as something measurable, physical and knowable, a shift that would, in time, dissolve the old moral boundaries entirely. Thus, good sex in the eyes of Tudor medicine was not passion but proportion, not indulgence but efficiency. It was the body functioning as nature intended, warm, balanced, and content. The soul might pray, the poet might dream, but the physician measured pulse, color, temperature, and tone. In the steady hands of these early healers, the mysteries of love were translated into charts and humours, their warmth preserved not in metaphor but in method. In the Tudor imagination, there was no boundary between the body and the cosmos. The same logic that governed the stars governed the heart. The same symmetry found in the heavens was mirrored in the household bed. To live rightly was to live in balance, and this harmony extended from the smallest gesture of affection to the grandest workings of the state. Love in its proper form was order. Disorder, whether of passion, appetite, or ambition, was the seed of chaos. This belief was not poetic fancy, but the very foundation of Tudor thought. The idea that the universe operated according to divine proportion came from the medieval notion of the great chain of being, a vast, invisible hierarchy linking God, angels, monarchs, men, women, and even animals in a perfect, descending sequence. Each had its appointed place, each owed obedience to what was above and care to what was below. The health of the cosmos depended on the maintenance of this order, and nowhere was it more vividly enacted than within marriage. The Tudor household was imagined as a microcosm of the kingdom. The husband was head and governor, reflecting the sovereign's authority, the wife his loyal subject, the children citizens under instruction. Harmony between them symbolized not only domestic virtue but national stability. When a marriage thrived, ruled by moderation, respect, and mutual duty, it echoed the orderly movement of the heavens. But when discord or lust intruded, it was seen as a fracture in the moral fabric of society, a small echo of rebellion against divine law. Writers and preachers of the period spoke tirelessly of this connection. In sermons, the home was likened to a little commonwealth, where each member had a station ordained by God. Marriage was not merely a contract of affection, but a discipline of governance. The husband, it was said, must temper authority with kindness, the wife obedience with prudence. In this symmetry lay the reflection of a just monarchy, and by extension a just universe. This cosmic vision infused even the most private acts with significance. To share the marriage bed was to reaffirm divine harmony. The physical joining of husband and wife was, in theory, a symbolic renewal of creation itself, the continuation of life, the preservation of balance. Just as the sun and moon moved in predictable cycles, so too were human desires meant to follow a rhythm of order and restraint. In this way, sex was never merely physical. It was moral, social, and celestial. The Tudor ideal of love, therefore, was not rooted in passion but in proportion. Love's virtue lay in its steadiness, its obedience to reason. Passion ungoverned could unmake kingdoms, a lesson learned all too vividly in the scandals of royal marriages. Henry VIII's pursuit of Anne Boleyn had unsettled the realm, divided the church, and rewritten the map of faith. To later generations it stood as both warning and parable. Desire must bow to order, or chaos would follow. Elizabeth's reign reinforced this moral symmetry. As a ruler who declared herself wedded to her people, she transformed the language of marriage into that of governance. Her subjects became her symbolic spouse, her care the measure of her authority. This metaphor, drawn from centuries of biblical imagery, fused politics and intimacy into one continuous moral narrative. To love rightly, whether one's spouse, one's sovereign, or one's God, was to act in harmony with the natural and divine order of all things. Even art and architecture reflected this conviction. Tudor design favored symmetry, in gardens, in palaces, in the ornament of household goods. Music, too, sought balance and proportion, its harmonies echoing the structure of the spheres. The same principles that guided composers in their counterpoint guided moralists in their counsel. Every note, every act must find its proper place. Disorder was not merely distasteful, it was dangerous, an affront to the divine geometry of the world. For ordinary people, these ideas filtered down through parish teaching, household manuals, and daily custom. The homilies on marriage read aloud in churches reminded couples that their union was sacred, not for pleasure's sake, but for the preservation of society. The husband's fidelity was a form of stewardship, the wife's chastity a reflection of the nation's virtue. When both fulfilled their parts, the body of England remained whole. When they failed, the order of the world seemed to tremble. Even sin, when discussed, carried this cosmic weight. Adultery, for example, was not simply betrayal, it was treason against divine hierarchy. Lust was rebellion of the flesh against reason, the same impulse that, if left unchecked, could drive subjects to rise against their king. To master desire, then, was to prove one's loyalty to God's creation. The moral discipline of the bedchamber was inseparable from the political discipline of the realm. And yet, there was tenderness in this structure, a sense that love, properly ordered, was the gentlest reflection of divine care. When writers like Sir Thomas Eliot or Richard Hooker spoke of marriage, they did not speak in cold abstractions. They described it as a partnership of souls, united not by passion but by purpose. Affection was encouraged, even cherished, so long as it served the greater balance of duty and faith. Love's nobility lay in its constancy, its refusal to be swayed by the storms of appetite. Thus, good sex, in its highest Tudor sense, was not merely a matter of pleasure, health, or even fertility. It was an act that confirmed one's place in the grand design of the universe. The body, disciplined and devout, became a vessel of cosmic symmetry, a mirror of divine order reflected in flesh and feeling. To live within that order was to live rightly. To break it was to invite chaos both within and beyond. And so, in the quiet hours when husband and wife lay side by side beneath the flickering light of the hearth, they were not merely two souls in companionship, but two notes in a celestial harmony, small yet essential to the music of the world. As the 16th century drew toward its close, the calm symmetry of Tudor moral order began to stir with new ideas. Humanism, that great intellectual current that placed dignity and reason at the heart of human life, quietly reshaped how people thought about love, marriage, and the body. What had once been a union of hierarchy and duty began to be seen as a fellowship of souls. Writers of the late Tudor and early Elizabethan age, influenced by classical thought and gentle reform, started to question whether affection might have as much moral worth as obedience. They did not abandon the old belief that marriage was ordained by God, but they added a new layer: companionship. A husband and wife, they said, were not merely ruler and subject, but partners in virtue. This shift was subtle yet profound. In humanist texts, good sex was no longer only a matter of procreation or temperance, it was part of mutual love, an expression of emotional and spiritual harmony. The language remained pious, yet beneath the scripture ran a tender undercurrent, that true union required not just bodies in balance but hearts in conversation. Writers like Erasmus and Thomas More, though devout, hinted at this new gentleness. They imagined marriage as a place of dialogue and shared wisdom. To please one's spouse was not a carnal indulgence, but an act of moral care, a means of strengthening affection and maintaining peace within the household. Poetry, too, began to reflect this evolution. Where earlier verse spoke of restraint and virtue, later Elizabethan poets wove affection and admiration into the moral fabric of love. Words like mutual delight and spiritual friendship appeared in writings meant for the devout and learned. The old Tudor order still demanded discipline, but now it made room for feeling, a quiet recognition that desire, when guided by love, could itself be virtuous. This transformation did not overturn the world overnight. The Church still guarded its teachings. Preachers still warned against lust and vanity, yet the human heart was beginning to speak more freely within those walls. Marriage, once a small reflection of divine order, was now also a space where two individuals might find joy, understanding, and shared purpose. It was, in its way, the dawn of something modern, a new moral imagination in which reason and tenderness could coexist. Good sex in this light was not only a sign of fertility or restraint, but of harmony between two souls, bound not only by duty, but by love itself. And so, as the Tudor world moved toward the threshold of the 17th century, the language of order softened into the language of affection. The cosmos still sang of hierarchy, but in its song a new note emerged, quieter, warmer, and profoundly human. In the candlelit bedrooms of Tudor England, affection was rarely free from the presence of conscience. Beneath every act of closeness lingered the watchful eye of heaven, or so many believed. The Reformation had stripped away the confessional booth, but not the instinct to confess. People turned instead to their diaries, to whispered prayers before sleep, to the secret corners of their minds where sin still wore a familiar face. Guilt in this world was not merely emotional, it was theological. From childhood, the Tudor subject was taught that the flesh was weak, the heart deceitful, and temptation ever near. Lust was described as a spark from hell, capable of consuming even the most devout. The very dreams that flickered behind closed eyes were suspect. An impure thought was said to endanger the soul as surely as a forbidden act. Medical writers blending faith and physiology claimed that these restless stirrings were signs of excess heat, of humours misaligned. The body, they said, could betray the spirit. Men were warned that nocturnal emissions drained vitality, while women who confessed to vivid dreams were told to pray for chastity and control. What we might now call psychology, they described as spiritual warfare. Even among married couples, whose union was sanctioned by the church, there remained a subtle unease, the fear of pleasure taken too eagerly, of indulgence mistaken for virtue. Good sex, as physicians and preachers reminded them, must always serve reason and moderation. Too much laughter, too much longing, and the act might slip from health into sin. The diaries of Tudor women, when they survive, speak of this tension in fragile tones. Some wrote of duty fulfilled without joy, others confessed to the pain of desiring affection when affection felt forbidden. Men too struggled with the moral geometry of desire, weighing passion against prayer, the body against the soul. In these small acts of confession, a pattern emerges. The Tudor conscience was not quiet. It pulsed beneath every sermon and superstition, reminding each believer that God's eye missed nothing, not even the thoughts that came in darkness. And yet, for all its fear, there was a kind of comfort in that watchfulness. To feel guilt was to feel seen. To wrestle with desire was to prove one's faith still fought within the flesh. By the end of Elizabeth's reign, this tension between affection and fear, pleasure and repentance, had become part of England's moral inheritance. The next century would inherit not only its learning and poetry, but its unease, the sense that the body was both a blessing and a burden, both a vessel of love and a battlefield of conscience. When the Tudor era gave way to the Stuart age and beyond, its view of sex, measured, cautious, steeped in moral language, did not vanish. It evolved, reshaped by time, but never forgotten. The idea that good sex was an act of moderation, a matter of duty more than desire, became an unspoken truth, woven into the English psyche. For centuries afterward, sermons, medical manuals, and household guides echoed Tudor reasoning. They continued to teach that the body was both gift and test, that pleasure must serve virtue, and that restraint was the finest sign of civility. In this way, the Tudor conscience became a kind of moral compass for generations who would never know Henry or Elizabeth, yet would feel their influence in every rule of conduct. Even as science advanced and religion fractured further, the outlines of Tudor thought remained clear. Physicians of the 17th and 18th centuries still spoke of balance and moderation, now cloaked in the language of anatomy and natural law rather than humours and divine order. What had once been God's will became nature's design, but the lesson was the same, that too much indulgence led to decay, and temperance preserved both body and soul. Marriage manuals, ever popular among the literate classes, repeated the same quiet formula. The household was the kingdom in miniature, the husband its governor, the wife its heart and conscience. Order and obedience, love and prudence, these words drifted through the centuries like inherited prayers, and beneath them, the private life of the body remained guarded, whispered about, shrouded in modesty. By the 19th century, this inheritance took on new forms. The Victorians, with their lace and repression, did not invent prudery, they refined it. They turned the Tudor balance into moral architecture, building walls of propriety where the Tudors had built boundaries of faith. What the 16th century had whispered, the 19th century codified. The marriage bed became not only sacred but silent. Pleasure, though acknowledged, was rarely named. Yet even this restraint carried the echo of something older, that desire must be disciplined, that intimacy was a matter of moral weight, that the union of man and woman reflected not chaos, but divine order. Beneath the tight collars and drawn curtains of the Victorian home lived the same humoral ghosts that had haunted Tudor England. The belief that good health and good conduct were intertwined. Still, not all of the Tudor legacy was shadow. There remained, even in their restraint, a certain grace, the notion that love was part of life's balance, that the body and soul could coexist in quiet harmony. It was a vision of moderation that endured through the centuries, shaping how England thought about love, morality, and the unseen rhythm of domestic life. The Tudor sense of good sex, private, temperate, bound to affection and faith, became one of the quiet foundations of the modern Western conscience. It was an inheritance neither wholly repressive nor wholly free, but steady, measured, and enduring. And so, from the flickering candles of Tudor bedchambers to the shadowed parlours of the Victorian age, the same idea persisted, that virtue lies not in denial, but in control, and that the harmony of body and soul is the truest reflection of divine order. In the end, when all the sermons have faded, and the candles of the Tudor chambers have long since gone out, what remains is a world that sought balance above all else. For the Tudors, good sex was never a rebellion, never an indulgence. It was a measured, deliberate act, an echo of divine symmetry, where the stirrings of the body were meant to mirror the order of heaven. They lived in a time when every heartbeat carried moral meaning, when even the most private act was seen through the lens of faith, medicine, and philosophy. To them, the body was not merely flesh, but a vessel of cosmic order, a living map of the Creator's design. To live well meant to love well, and to love well meant to do so with restraint, awareness, and intention. Their understanding of desire was quiet, almost mathematical. Too much, and one invited decay. Too little, and one fell into imbalance. The ideal lay in moderation, a rhythm of giving and receiving that preserved health, virtue, and the sacred order of the world. In that delicate equilibrium, the Tudors found meaning and intimacy that was neither wild nor cold, but purposeful, reverent, and calm. From the grand halls of Henry's court to the humble cottages of the countryside, this belief held firm. It whispered through medical tracts and moral guides, through confessions and love poems alike. Good sex, they believed, was not a moment of escape from duty, but its quiet continuation, a joining of souls that kept the household, and by extension the nation, in harmony. Even the humoral theories that governed their understanding, the mingling of heat and moisture, the balance of fluids within, spoke of a world that prized proportion over excess. The act itself was not sinful, nor was it sacred in isolation. It was the natural exchange between two beings bound by law, faith, and affection. Perhaps that is why their beliefs have endured in subtler forms. In every age that has followed, from Puritan sermons to Victorian etiquette, we can still feel the Tudor heartbeat beneath the surface, a cautious reverence for love, a fear of chaos, a longing for order. What they sought was not ecstasy, but alignment, the soul and the body turning together, like the celestial spheres they believed governed all things. And so, in their eyes, the act of love became something more than physical. It was the body's quiet agreement with God's design, a reflection of divine geometry played out in the soft rhythm of mortal hearts. Theirs was a morality neither austere nor indulgent, but serene, grounded in a world where medicine, faith, and emotion could still be one and the same. As night deepens over the imagined Tudor world, the flicker of tallow candles, the hush of a wooden room, the weight of linen and conscience alike, the meaning of good sex becomes almost meditative. It was never about power or shame, but about balance, the still center between virtue and desire, between life and its divine source. And so the story closes, not with fervor but with stillness. The Tudors, for all their contradictions and fears, understood something that would outlast them, that love, when tempered with understanding, becomes a kind of order, a harmony of the human and the holy, a whisper of creation itself. In their quiet way, they believed that the greatest intimacy was not the loss of control, but its perfect measure, a poised reflection of the universe's calm design.